Okay. Okay. So I'm going to get my geek on and I'm going to say, welcome to the program. This is Chasing the Dream. It's this little old workplace culture podcast. My name is Ethan. I'm the host. And I've been waiting for decades to have this gentleman in front of us today. So don't get weird if I look incredibly odd or uncomfortable, which I don't typically do. But I'm going to introduce to the program Bill Coffin, editor in chief of Ethisphere magazine, and Bill's an award-winning business journalist with a significantly deep background in insurance and risk management, compliance, and the ethics spaces. He's a self-described strategic storyteller, and he possesses thought leadership within the financial services industry. He's the winner of multiple editorial and design awards, and his work has appeared in such renowned media outlets as the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, Forbes, and Fortune, and other well-respected news reporting formats. So welcome to Chasing the Dream, Bill.
Ethan, thank you very much for having me. I'm just delighted to be here. What a great way to start the new year.
Amen. Me too. And I did share with you when I talk about getting super excited about having you on the program. This does go back for me decades. Early on, when I started my practice and I wrote my second book, The Compassionate Organization, it took me about 10 years. And a lot of the research that I used in terms of looking at organizations' ethical behavior, their culture, and their financial performance, it all kind of emulated from the work being done at Ethisphere. So I'm just super appreciative that you took some time to come on the program today.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Well, I get where you're coming from. The world of business integrity matters a great deal to me, and I feel I am very honored and very privileged to be able to do the work that I do, because it helps to kind of make the world a better place by advancing business integrity. That's what we're all about, and I feel that I've been adjacent to this space for quite a long portion of my career. And the last 10 years or so, I've been able to really dive into it head first. And it's been a great place to be, because we get to do some very meaningful work with some terrific companies. And you get to see directly how this work impacts organizations, big and small, domestic and
Yep.
international, and how they can make these changes that make them better organizations, make for better workplace cultures. And in the end, make the world a better place all around them. So it's a good place to be.
Well, and certainly people may or may not know this about you, but as you were sharing with me previously, your passion goes way back in terms of ethical behavior, organizational culture, and we've also talked previously about the need for psychological safety in the workspace. And I guess my first question that I wanted to ask you is with respect to your unique access to organizations and research and you speaking to so many people, what are you seeing as some pretty significant trends? And I'm going to say specifically after COVID and the world of work that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I'm so glad you kind of made that notion of after COVID, because one of the metaphors I like to talk about is when you look at, say, like the growth rings of a tree, right? If you cut down a tree, look at the growth rings, you can tell where there was a really serious period of drought or like a forest fire that the tree survived, because there'll be like a particularly dark or discolored line, in the growth ring, and it's like one of the before and after moments for the life cycle of the tree. And COVID was a real before and after moment for workplace culture in general. Every organization had to really radically and very quickly adjust to deal with it. I remember COVID specifically. I was working for an international organization in their communications department, a global organization, in fact. And I was part of a very small team that got daily briefings the very moment COVID first started coming. So before it became a news story, I knew about COVID and was getting these daily briefings and hearing, like, here's where it's going, here's where it's spreading, here's what we have to do, here's how we have to prepare. And that was a pretty frightening time. And I remember thinking, like, no company will be the same after this. Like, once it became a full-blown pandemic, it was like no company will be the same. I just didn't know how. And that working remote aspect of it really became a massive part of how people redraw their lines between their personal life and their professional life, especially when you're doing the both, both in the same building, if you're working from home. Um, and organizations, may switch to a fully remote status. Some of them stayed that way. The company I work for now, Ethisphere, has always been 100% remote, and has worked very, very hard to kind of create an intentional culture that takes advantage of that remote aspect and also puts in extra work to make sure that the culture thrives because of it. So but post COVID was interesting because a lot of organizations had to really change specifically how they manage people. A lot of the work we do here at Ethisphere, it's around corporate culture, it's around company culture, around ethical culture. And on all of those things, perhaps the most single important aspect of it is coming back to the people managers, right? Your culture, your cultural experience is probably most impactfully, designated or directed by your relationship with your manager. How your manager guides you, how they deal with you, how they help you handle problems. And as you know, at many more organizations, managers aren't specifically trained to be managers. They just sort of fall into their role, right?
Yeah, I mean, very few are, to be
Right.
honest.
And these are usually they're good people. They're great at what they do. They get promoted into a leadership position and are sort of left to sort of figure that out. And it's tough because it's a totally different skill set. Um, so how people managers behave is a huge determinant in the health of an organizational culture. COVID redrew how every manager had to manage. And even when people came back into the office afterwards, those expectations didn't change. You had a lot of folks, especially Gen Z employees, who had really sharply divided expectations with how they work in terms of work-life balance, in terms of tolerating workplace bullying or workplace mistreatment, in terms of raise your hand culture, in
Mhm.
terms of how they expected to be recognized for the work they did and rewarded for the work they did. Um, and it's required every organization to kind of really do a big rethink on how their managers manage and what kind of culture that creates. And most
And I
important,
do want to jump in. I do
yeah,
want to
yeah,
jump in because this raises for me. I mean, every time you and I have spoken, I mean, every time you say something, it raises like 10 questions that I have that I want to follow up with. But specifically in terms of what you just said about different expectations as the workforce kind of reforms with boomers and matures leaving, Gen Zs and millennials coming in and then starting to become managers themselves. What are you seeing as the impact? Like what is best practice in terms of building strong culture, given the needs of Gen Zs, given this hybrid and remote work post COVID? What are you seeing as some of the successful adaptation strategies?
yeah. I think that a really probably for me the core of it, where it all starts, is with this notion of psychological safety.
Okay.
Um, you know, every organization has a degree of psychological safety within its culture, whether they know it or not. Some organizations don't know it; they don't realize it, but it's all there. And what is psychological safety, right? Psychological safety is that set of expectations that you feel that you can make yourself vulnerable within the workspace so that you may bring your best effort, so you may question the way things are done, so you can put forth new ideas that may or may not work or may not be accepted. These are all the different things that go into psychological safety. Um, and I think it's very helpful when organizations train their managers to know what psychological safety is, to know what strong psychological safety looks like, and to understand the correlation between strong psychological safety and better workplace output, better productivity, better innovation, workers who are more invested in their workplace. Far and away, for me, I think that's the biggest thing that I see, because I one of the wonderful things about my job at Ethisphere is that I get to talk to ethics and compliance leaders from around the world, from many different organizations. Many of them are from organizations that have received really high recognition for their program. So they know what they're doing, right? And they know what a good culture looks like because they've built them themselves. And every single one of those people always talks about the importance of psychological safety and how that informs their workplace culture. So, in terms of what can they do to promote these things, like what does that really
Right.
mean, though, right? That means things like regular ongoing communication with your managers. That means clearly stating the values of your organization and then finding ways to put those values into practice and show proof points to people that we actually mean what we say, we live by our values, right? Um, that means that means encouraging people to speak up in every way that they can, whether it's to offer an idea at a meeting, whether it's to call out misconduct or to raise a question over how something is being done, and to do it in a way that does not actually turn around and harm them in the long run, right? You can raise your hand to call out misconduct and not be retaliated against. You can bring forth a new product idea and not be told, hey, stay in your lane. You can raise a question in a meeting and not be shouted down or talked down to by the seniors at the meeting going, hey, how dare you question the way we're doing these things? These are things you
Yeah,
can avoid and therefore boost psychological safety.
because everything you say is so logical and yet so self-evident. The one thing that I'm wondering about in the list that you talked about, regular communications with your manager, encourage people to speaking up without fear of reprisal or retribution. But the other thing you say is live your values. How does an organization, for example, some of the ones that you've witnessed in certain industries, let's say financial services, how do they foster a culture of living values when a lot of these organizations they don't even know what their values are? If if you survey your middle management or leadership team and said,
Yeah.
what are all our core values? How many would actually know? And to my question again is how do you enforce or how do you encourage employees living your values? Like how do you make that work?
Yeah. So I'll say that in my own experience, probably the most effective way of reinforcing that lived value piece of your daily experience is more through encouragement and recognition rather than kind of enforcement when it's not around, right? I mean, the idea is, and this is kind of what we get to with ethics and compliance, right? Like compliance is a law you must force. Ethics is a way you live your life, right? If you're great at ethics, then compliance kind of takes a back seat because you don't need to do, you're not going to do the things that compliance is there to stop, right? Um, so regular recognition of people who have actually done things that really exemplify what your values are and raising it up at the highest level and really putting people on a pedestal when they've done something great. That is a very strong way to do it. A lot of organizations don't take the time to do that. But if you can carve out time in your meetings, right, big and small, right, from the biggest town hall down to your weekly team get together, carve out just a sliver of time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just to go, hey, here's the big high five for the meeting. Here's the big, here's the big moment where somebody actually did something. We want to, we want to call out, last week, one of our big values is to be bold. And last week, Ethan at a meeting had this really great idea. He brought up, he'd been hanging on to it for a while. He offered it in a state of, in a spirit of leaning in. And you know what? It's an idea. We're going to take a look at it. We like it, but Ethan, thank you for bringing that up. That's what we're talking about here. That sort of like public acknowledgement goes a really long way. And a lot of organizations don't do it. But I think
Yeah, I mean,
that's something you can do.
it seems so easy, and it doesn't. I mean, easy in terms of you could literally implement it right now. After you saw Bill on Chasing-the-Dream, you heard that and you said, we've got to implement this immediately. And it almost sounds to me like it's a combination of public praise, but also spinning on its head that notion of caught in the act, where usually caught in the act is a bad thing, like hands in the cookie jar or misbehaving.
Yeah.
But you're saying to publicly praise somebody who's living our values.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And to follow that, a lot of people may think, okay, that's one more thing the manager has to do. Not necessarily. Part and parcel of that is encouraging everybody at the organization to look at their colleagues, to be mindful of the people they work with and go, you know what, these are our values. When you see these values in effect, we want you to raise your hand and to point out to people going, hey, you know what? I was in a meeting with Ethan. I don't report to Ethan. I don't work alongside him all the time. He's not one of my direct reports necessarily, but I like the cut of his jib. I like what he did. I thought it was really fantastic. And you know what? I'm going to find his direct, his manager and go, hey, so-and-so, you know what? You should know Ethan did this great thing and it's in line with who we are. And you may not know about this, but I think you should know about it. That's like the positive side of raising your hand or speak up culture as we like to say. And that is a huge piece of this because when you kind of crowdsource recognition across your organization, that creates a mutually reinforcing structure where people know, you know what, I can give of myself. It really costs nothing to call out great behavior so it gets built up. And that means that if I do great behavior, I'm confident that people around me will see that and they'll lift me up as well. It doesn't have to be a one-for-one transactional thing. It could be a very giving experience and understand that in time or environmentally, you will receive the same accolades yourself.
Yeah, first of all, you and I are completely in sync in terms of our value constructs, and I totally get what you say. But everything that I heard you just say in terms of recognizing one another and living the values, it smacks to me of something really scary called emotional intelligence, and that
Yeah.
you almost have to say, as a precursor to having a great culture, we need to hire people differently rather than just doing the work, is having these kind of behaviors and their own values. Do you find in your kind of experience with psychological safety and building great culture that organizations are actually going about recruiting people who are more empathetic, aware, socially engaged? Like, is there some kind of secret sauce that you found from all of your work?
Yeah, you know what? So like attracts like. So I've been in organizations with outstanding cultures. Ethisphere has an outstanding culture, and great cultures. It's funny, once you get a strong culture built, it tends to self-reinforce because it doesn't. Generally speaking, you have a sense of who you want to work with, and that kind of creates a way of we don't want to bring in somebody who's going to be completely antithetical to how we believe, how we live, and is going to be super disruptive to all that. But I think
Yeah.
backing up, there are a lot of organizations that are like, you know what, we'd like a better culture than what we have. How do we get there? And how do we kind of start adding in these aspects of the things you and I are talking about? And I'll go back to something very fundamental that our co-CEO, our chief strategy officer, Erica Salmon Byrne, says a lot. Erica and I do a lot of work together on the Ethicast, our video podcasting program. And she's just a simply scintillating colleague to work with. She's probably the most brilliant person I've ever met in the ethics compliance space. She's absolutely fantastic. But she goes, when you're talking about things like how do you build a strong culture, right? There's kind of four key things you want to keep in mind, which is who do you fire, who do you who do you hire, who do you fire, who do you praise, who do you promote, and then it also gets back to how do you hire, how do you fire, how do you praise, how do you promote, right? And all four of those things are deeply interconnected, and they're also mutually reinforcing. And they can be a positive thing. If you look at how you hire, what values are you looking at in the people you bring in, not just in terms of their skill set, but also how they choose to employ those. What's their personal culture, and how's that going to interface with the values you have? Do they reflect, do they naturally harmonize with the values of your organization? If they don't, you're going to have work to do when you bring them in, right? If
Right,
they,
right.
but that's always a worthy effort though. But if they already do, their on ramp to your organization is going to be flat. So they're going to be able to slot right in, connect and harmonize with people, and start building value right off the bat, right? When you talk about who do you fire, how do you fire, that's a matter of, okay, making sure that there's very much open communication and understanding, it's a values play, but also understanding that if you have certain benchmarks need to be hit and people are hitting them, then as a matter of psychological safety, being radically open about it, being very transparent about it. So this is coming as a shock to nobody, and multiple, different opportunities to change course, to seek help, to get the support they need. Those are all parts of that firing piece, absent, of course, misconduct.
Right.
But that make that whole process something that is not a shock, or it doesn't feel arbitrary or capricious. And that's a huge piece of psychological safety right there. Who you praise, who you promote. A lot of that gets down to what you and I were just talking about, but also when you have cultures that are in trouble, and you often see this in organizations that have had serious misconduct issues, who you praise, who you promote is a really important piece of it, because sometimes you have people who are and you and I have encountered people like this in our career. I'm sure all your listeners have. Some organizations have real high performers who
Yeah.
personally exhibit terrible cultural aspects, and they're given a
Right.
pass because they're the high performer, right?
Right, they're the rainmakers, they're the
They're the
revenue
rainmakers, right?
generators. So we turn a blind eye when we know it only takes one toxic individual strategically placed to literally destroy a culture.
Exactly. One drop of poison, taints the well, Eh,
Yes.
and so who you praise, who you promote, it's making those tough choices, going, we're going to praise the behavior we want to see, we're going to promote the behavior we have to have, and making those hard choices, going, what, hey, Bill, you've been crushing on your numbers, it's been fantastic. However, you talk people down at meetings, you're disrespectful to your colleagues, you're playing fast and loose with certain things. These are not these are not ingredients for success in our organization. And we see this. We want to help you work on these things, but we can't bring you to the next level until you bring yourself there in terms of the values. And it's easy, it's expedient to not do those things.
Right.
But organizations that stop and are intentional and spend the energy to have those conversations, they build better employees. And frankly, they build better success in the long run because it's more sustainable success.
You talked before about once you build it. I was very intentional about catching this piece. You just mentioned the fact that once you build an amazing culture, it's self-perpetuating because you've got this amazing reputational brand. So people who share your values are going to be predisposed to want to go for, let's say, a Patagonia or a Tom shoes.
Sure.
So that makes perfect sense to me. Here's something that I just took away from what you were saying about complete honesty, transparency, and openness is I've heard you say a number of times in our prior conversations, and when I've watched your podcast, you talk about organizations always erring on the side of more communication, right? Like one of my takeaways from all your amazing work is it's rare when an organization tends to get in trouble because they've over communicated.
True.
So that's I really appreciate that. You also talk a lot about values. I mean, getting back to the conversation before about values, and you mentioned before we started to hit the record button, Ethisphere is literally in the process of right now changing its pillars of ethics. Can you talk a little bit about historically what they were, what they're changing to, and why those pillars of ethics you think are so important at Ethisphere?
Oh, I'd be glad to. Yeah. So, Ethisphere has produced this kind of a document that is a keystone in many ways. I refer to it all the time in my work, and it's the pillar. It's the 8 pillars of an ethical culture. We talk about what are the aspects of an ethical culture that you can kind of look at and that you can measure, so you can actually look at and seeing, well, how strong is it? How much can be improved? And it's part of a larger part of our cultural assessment programs. But they are 8 kind of key aspects of your culture that you could pay attention to, that if you look at them very closely, you can get a sense of, all right, where are we? How can we actually, improve or stay strong? And those and we're in the middle of revising these pillars right now. So sometime in, I believe, Q1 of 2025, we'll be releasing a revised version of these. And we're revising them because it reflects the ongoing evolution of the business integrity space. Ethics and compliance are not static things. They do not simply live suspended in amber. And we're always trying to change these things to best reflect the world that we're in. But for the moment, right now, the 8 pillars are awareness of the ethics and compliance program, perceptions of that function, observing and reporting misconduct, pressure. Now, pressure means the degree to which people within the organization will pressure you to not abide by certain rules or strictures because we need to make numbers, we need to make sales.
Right.
Does that pressure exist? Is that pressure kind of sort of accepted, really? So that's what pressure is about. Organizational justice are people dealt with fairly regardless of where they are in the organization and what their seniority is? And then perceptions of managers. Is my manager somebody who can help me, or somebody I can trust to bring issues to? Perceptions of leadership. Do they walk the walk? And then perceptions of peers and environment. So those are all, those are the 8 pillars of an ethical culture. And there's a lot of information on all of those. If you're interested in reading it, you can go to ethisphere.com and check out the organization. It's a free document, so you can download it there. But it's a really, really foundational piece to a lot of the efforts we do. That, as I like to say, we're kind of in the business of elevating ethics and integrity from a subjective art to a quantifiable science. And these pillars are a big part of that.
And the reason I asked specifically, other than I'm in love with the whole idea of pillars of ethical behavior, but back when I was, going back to like 2010, 2011, when I was kind of diving into the book, the first place that I read about an organization that was literally shifting the focus from subjectivity and what is culture to being able to objectively measure it was Ethisphere. And so this notion of how do you measure culture now is a precursor first step to being able to change it. Like
Yeah.
you don't know where you're going. Any road will take you there if you don't know what culture is. And that's
Yeah.
why I'm such a passionate advocate of what Ethisphere does. But I also want to ask you another question, if you don't mind, about culture.
Yeah.
Is who the hell is responsible for it? Like in an organization, whose job is it to build it? Because it's kind of like that Chinese proverb, having blind
Yeah.
people touch an elephant. I've
Yeah.
asked business owners, they don't want any part of it, or if they do, they don't know where to begin. I've asked leadership teams, and they'll say, well, that's not our responsibility. We hire people. I've asked managers, and like you said, a lot of managers aren't trained in the
Yeah.
people side of managing. And it seems a little bit unfair to expect employees to do it themselves. And I do know that sometimes it happens with somebody who's really well respected, who's a senior person, who's a champion. But where do you go to
Where do you
start?
go?
That's my question for you. Where do you go?
the the answer is as simple as it is confounding. The answer is, who's responsible for culture? I
Everybody.
am. Me. I am. Everybody in a culture is responsible for that culture. There is no
Okay.
one person who can own a culture. There's no one person who can define or drive a culture. Culture is inherently decentralized. It is in everybody, whether you like it or not. And so it's everybody's responsibility to do what they can to and to make the culture better, but also to recognize the fact that everything you do contributes to the culture. When I was in college, what blew my mind, actually probably started my whole journey in this piece of my profession, is I took an anthropology class, a cultural anthropology class, and it talked about how culture is the transmission of learned information. That's the beginning of it. Right. That's why you can say like sea otters have culture, because they teach each other how to use those rocks to bang, abalone shells apart. Or chimpanzees have culture because they can teach each other, hey, take this piece of grass, put it in a termite mound, you can get a tasty snack. Right. That's where culture begins. Culture is how we transmit learned information. Okay. And culture is not waiting to be told what to do necessarily. It's about, how do I pass along what I have learned, but intentionally, unintentionally, consciously, unconsciously. Last year, I had a tremendous privilege and honor working with Erica Salmon-Byrne on a really large thought leadership project. And she shared with me a bunch of outstanding stories of leaders she had talked to who had worked at companies that had built fantastic cultures, that had rehabilitated their culture, that had dealt with organizations that were trying to come back from serious like regulatory issues, and there are a bunch of stories in that, but the one that really struck me was one where she's talking about, basically, this guy's going, we're gonna have to restart this thing. Who's responsible for this? I am. They actually made buttons for people to wear. It just says I am, right? That was a symbol that people walked around going, I'm, whether you are, working in the cafeteria downstairs, whether you are in the C-suite, you are all equally responsible for the role you have to play, the role you can play in supporting the culture, in driving the things you all agree to. Those values are your shared expectations of behavior and aspiration. And it's not on any one person. Different people have different shares of it, and different people have different strategic ways in which they can make perhaps a bigger impact than others. The ethics compliance team has a particularly interesting role in helping to drive culture, as does human resources, as does communications. But all of these things are part of a networked event. No one aspect of it can carry the weight alone, nor should they.
The democratization of culture is transmitting learned behavior. That to me is such a mind blow in terms
Yeah.
of being able to articulate that to somebody or people in an organization who say, we're here, whatever the here is, we're suboptimal, and we want to get there. I'm hearing what that work with Erica kind of directionally said was, everybody has to grab on to
Yeah.
the steering wheel.
And here's why it's especially important now, Ethan, because we see out in the world, there is a certain lionization of more autocratic business leaders out there. People who they run a business almost like it's a cult of personality. They run it simply, I alone can fix this. It's my way. There's no other way than how I do that. And sometimes these people are very forceful and charismatic, and people kind of end up following them anyway. Sometimes they are, frankly, criminals dressed in nice clothing, and their efforts eventually come crashing down, right? But super autocratic business leaders, though, they fail to understand one very, very key thing, which is this. And this is a phenomenon that exists well outside business. We've seen this in history. We've seen this happen to entire nations
But
in the
we see
past.
a global evolution where
Right.
societies are moving towards dictatorial regimes.
Right. But and what's scary about it is that even if you have somebody who governs in that way or who leads in that way, and they are themselves entirely benevolent, that form of leadership does not, as far as culture being the transmission of learned information, that form of leadership does not transmit information to the rest of the organization in a way that can be easily absorbed, right? So,
well, because it's my way or the highway.
right. And eventually, yeah, and no one leads forever. So eventually that person stops leading, and now you have an organization that's left with a gaping hole where a leader used to be, and it doesn't have anything to fill that hole. And sometimes
because that was
stuff,
cult of personality, right?
right, exactly. So when we talk about like who's responsible for the culture, I am. That not only makes for a really strong culture, one of the reasons why it makes for a really strong culture is because people leave companies all the time for all different kinds of reasons, right? But in a culture like that, if somebody leaves, it's not leaving such a massive hole that can't be filled because everybody else, that fabric automatically reknits itself. And so,
Right.
so that's why that way of pursuing a culture, I think, is so much more sustainable and so much more resilient than an autocratic, it's my way or the highway, or look upon me, your philosopher king
Right.
kind of way of running an organization.
But I would also imagine that cult of personality, or the culture is what the top dog says it is, plays out sometimes in family-run businesses,
Mm,
or post M&A activity. You have this um, influential individual, they step away, and then the culture becomes something unrecognizable to
yeah,
people who have been there for
yeah,
decades, perhaps, and then
yeah.
it has to reinvent itself, and often to its detriment, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's not always by surprise either. I mean, when you have an organization like that, like I said, nobody rules forever, nobody leads forever. Eventually, sometimes people, they kind of, you can tell they're in like the end stage of their leadership role, and people stop, they stop bringing their full selves to the organization, and they start devoting energy into imagining what their role in the next phase of this organization is going to be like, and that creates a period of operational kind of softness and grayness that is not, it's not fantastic, and it creates havoc before there's an actual leadership change, and it's a disintegration of order. It's not terrific.
Because when there is a lack of, let's say, existing culture, or a lack of anything that used to be there, there's activity that happens to fill that void. And
Yeah,
so, absent of a strong guiding culture, people will start to
yeah,
speculate, they'll check out emotionally, silent quitting, they'll do all the stuff you're alluding to. You
exactly.
know, the kind of thing about talking to you, Bill, is I feel like every time we schedule time, we could go 2 or 3 times longer. So what I'd love to do, if you're amenable, is to maybe have a follow-up or a callback when your schedule permits. But in the meantime, I just want to ask, how, if somebody wants to reach out to you and say, Bill, I heard what you said, I really want to get a better understanding, or as you said, geek out on other things, how can they get in touch with you?
Certainly. Well, I would say that the first and best way to dive much more deeply into all the things I've been talking about and the things that really occupy my time is head on over to ethisphere.com. And we've got
Okay.
a ton of resources there. That's where I go, frankly, when I want to learn more about it. Even though I'm in the machine, but I still go there and take part of our own our own resources. But certainly take a look at ethisphere.com. Go out over on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Subscribe to our program, the Ethicast, that produces 2 episodes a week. Um, Look me up on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat with you on LinkedIn. Shoot me an email at Ethisphere. I'd be happy to speak with you there. And if you're interested in like the stuff I do on the side, which is I have like a whole secret identity where I do a lot of geeky podcasting and writing and game design and all that sort of stuff, then look me up at billcoffin.com.
That was the other piece that I wanted to definitely highlight. And just to anybody who's watching, All of the contact details are going to be in the description below. So be sure to like the video, follow the YouTube channel, and send comments for Bill and I. But Bill, before I let you go, I just want to say thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to kind of realize, as I said, a dream that I've had for a long time.
Well, Ethan, it's been a delight being on your program. I'm really honored that you asked me to come on your show. This is a terrific program. Everybody out there, please subscribe. Please share this show. Ethan's doing it matters. It's a great piece of content that everybody should be taking in. So by all means, if you're revamping how you're taking in content for 2025, you want to up your game, please listen to the show, like it, subscribe to it, pass along to your friends. But Ethan, it's been a delight. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, and definitely reach out to Bill directly, and also explore Ethisphere. I mean, they've got a ton of resources that are available if you're even thinking about or not sure how to approach this thing of ethical behavior and culture. And the other piece I'll say about Ethisphere is they show you how to monetize culture, meaning we know that highly ethical organizations financially outperform others. We see it in every industry. We see it in nearly any country. So please go check out Bill and Ethisphere. And thank you, Bill, for coming on the show.